Hello, hello, hello. One idea that's been bounded about online for the last few years is that of the potential for civil war. People from all sorts of political backgrounds have been saying that things have got so bad already that they can surely only get so much worse before there is a spontaneous rebellion against the ruling elite which devolves into civil war. I, however, disagree. Not only do I disagree though, but I believe that there's an intentional and malicious reason why such ideas are not only permitted, but promoted. That is what I'm going to talk about today. Without further ado, let's get to it. First of all, I would like to examine the typical reasons given for why civil war is likely, then use historical and contemporary examples to utterly shred apart each one. If you, like me, already doubt the Civil War claim and are only interested in hearing why it's pushed regardless, then skip to the relevant chapter at this on-screen time. Otherwise, the typical reasons are given as follows. 1. Ethnic, religious or other group repression. 2. Economic decline or crisis. And 3. A weak regime. As far as I'm concerned, the last of these three likely is a contributing factor, with the other two providing ideological justification. But how do these stack up against our real circumstances, and are they enough to predict civil war? On the repression/group struggle front, people say that Britain is undergoing demographic changes of the likes never before seen in history, and with disastrous consequences no less. But is this a factor for civil war? The claim is thus made that this should make civil war inevitable. But is this so? Well, if it is, then how come modern America, which has gone from a nominal white population of 90% during World War II to 60% now, has not had a civil war? Also, bear in mind that this is a map of what the American census considers white. North Africans, Levantines, Middle Easterners, Afghans, Iranians, Kazakhs, Uzbeks, Turks, and even the bloody Sudanese. These people, according to any common sense opinion, are clearly not white. Not at least in the way that most people understand it. And so the actual white proportion of America is closer to 55%. Yet still no civil war. Okay, but what about crime rates? They've gone up pretty high, right? Well, yes, they have, but as bad as things are here, our crime statistics pale in comparison to those of America, which in turn pale in comparison to those of Mexico and Brazil. Yet, again, has there been a civil war in modern America? No. Has there been one in Mexico? No. And has there been one in Brazil? No. Right, what about the oppression of the native Brits then? Two-tier justice and all of that? Frankly, I shouldn't even have to mention it, but there are many cases in history where groups have been repressed far worse than we have, even when they too have been the majority, yet civil war never came. Simply put, none of these three things inevitably lead to civil war. Right, so next there's economic decline or crisis. Firstly, there's the idea of general poverty. Whilst poorer nations do tend to be less stable and do tend to have more civil wars, with there being an argument that he who has nothing to lose is willing to take greater risks, the level of poverty we are talking about here is incomprehensibly low compared to even some of the poorest British families. Frankly, we are not likely to ever return to such low levels, so even if extreme poverty is a factor, it's not one that applies to us. Okay, so what about the idea of wealth inequality? Again, we are far from the worst in this regard, with many countries in far worse positions also not looking likely to have a civil war anytime soon. Even if we look back at our own history, we see that wealth inequality was far worse in the past. Yet, the system back then was arguably a lot more stable than it is now. As far as I'm concerned, it's not a significant factor. Lastly on this point, there is the issue of decline and scarcity. Again, whilst extreme scarcity could cause things to kick off, scarcity and economic decline in this country are largely artificial and are both managed. If you watch my last video, you'll understand why so many industries and jobs have been offshored. Yes, doing so does harm the economic prospects of the nation, but we're hardly in a Zimbabwe-style freefall. If the decline needs to be reversed, it can be, and at worst, the benefit system is still seemingly enough for people to live a Western lifestyle. I mean, let's take another example, Venezuela. Though far from ever being one of the wealthiest nations on the planet, they were doing alright under Chavez. Then, under Maduro, their GDP plummeted by 80%. Yet, there was no spontaneous civil war there. Protests, sure, but no civil war. As far as I'm concerned then, economics too do not necessarily lead to civil war. Finally then, there is the third point, a weak regime. In my opinion, a weak regime definitely is a factor that increases the chance of civil war. However, this analysis misses a key detail. I don't think it's too controversial to claim that the regime running Mexico is incredibly weak. Much of the country is run by cartels, with the central government unable and/or unwilling to take back control. Yet, even in this debilitated state, Mexico has not had a civil war, nor looks likely to have one anytime soon. The fact is that a regime can be incredibly weak and can be incredibly unpopular without being toppled. What you actually need for a civil war is the one factor that all of these civil war alarmists are failing to mention: elite support from a rival or external faction. When we look in the past at Syria's civil wars, we notice that they all have one thing in common, something they needed before they even began. That is rival domestic or external elite backing. In the case of the War of the Roses, it was the backing of rival noblemen who each held their own power and alliances. In the case of the American Civil War, the rival elites were those of the Dixie states and the Union states. In the Jacobite rebellions, there was the backing of France. In the American War of Independence too, backing came from France, and the Yanks would not have succeeded had it not been for France. In Korea, it was the powers of the Second World versus the powers of the First World, by which I mean the communist-aligned nations versus the liberal-aligned nations. In the Kosovo War, Kosovo was backed by the West, while Serbia was backed by Russia. And, most surprisingly, in the Bolshevik Revolution, Vladimir Lenin was backed by none other than Germany. What we can take from this is that in order to have a civil war, both sides must have backing from organised elites who themselves hold real power. Do please watch my video, The Alarming Nature of True Power, to understand what true power is, because when you do, you'll understand why, when it comes down to the matters of rule, all your rhetoric, vibe shifts, feels, aesthetics, shifting of the Overton window, and moral victories ultimately amount to bugger all. Only the factions who hold true power make a real difference. To return to a previous example, Mexico, though I can personally attest to its beauty where I've been, is a dysfunctional state. Yet, there is no powerful faction, domestic or foreign, that wants to topple the Mexican regime. Rather, everyone, including the government, including the cartels, and including America, is pretty happy with the status quo. In Argentina, though, the Yanks wanted to fight the commies, so backed a coup d'etat, installing the military junta. Whilst technically not a civil war because there was no war part, it was a change of the regime made possible by foreign elite power. In the case of Afghanistan, the civil war there was entirely unnatural and only made possible by foreign powers. Then, when the foreign powers pulled out, as has happened countless times throughout history, the country returned to the antebellum status quo. And so, in modern America, there has been no civil war because there is no faction with anywhere near enough power and will to go against the American regime. The American regime is hegemonic and monolithic, meaning all meaningful power is subjugated to itself. The same is true of Britain, with the British establishment being totally dominant domestically, or at least insofar as it is a vassal state of the global American empire. There is no capable faction that backs a new British civil war, so such a civil war simply will not happen. However, the idea that it can and will happen is still pushed by various pundits. So why is that? If you know anything about how the regime operates, you'll know that many ideas that would be too controversial or destabilising for the government or any politician to say are instead said by puppet pundits who are, in some way or another, on the regime payroll. These people are not always easy to identify, especially to the untrained eye, but the safe bet is to assume that almost everyone with a large platform, and especially anyone who frequently interviews politicians, is a bought and paid for hack pushing the regime agenda. What I have noticed is that it's a number of these people who have been pushing the idea of a civil war. But why? Why, as I claim, would the ruling regime of this country want people to get excited about the prospect of civil war, the total breakdown of society into factions that want to topple said regime? The answer is false hope. The idea of spontaneous civil war is that things will reach a point where they become so bad that the people suddenly decide to rebel. The hidden assumption here, though, is that there is such a thing as too bad, that there is a red line that cannot be crossed, that there is a rock bottom level which, once reached, will naturally and spontaneously bring about corrective restorative action from the noble masses. This idea that there is a fundamental limit to how bad things can get is exactly what gives people false hope, and is exactly what the regime wants people to think. The fact is, though, that there is no such limit. For all the reasons outlined earlier, despite how far this nation has fallen, and despite how severe the decline has been, there is no realistic chance of our country devolving spontaneously into civil war. If there is any lesson you should take from George Orwell's 1984, it should be this. Hope does not lie in the proles. Hope never lies in the proles. However, for a moment, imagine that you are the average person. You see the decay around you, the streets you no longer recognise, the foreign faces you do not trust, the hypergamous, sinful, hedonistic, crippled, backwards culture that our nation has become, and you despair at how things have fallen and how far they may yet fall. If you knew that there is no limit to how far things may yet fall, that things will not stop getting worse until someone makes them stop getting worse, but that said person is not guaranteed to come, then your thoughts may turn very radical. You may start plotting how exactly you might stop this, and how you might get rid of the evil people who are doing this to you. You may start to organise, and you may eventually pose a real threat. Alternatively, if you believe that there is a coming civil war, you can rest easy knowing that there is a bottom, knowing that you do not have to do anything at all, and that these things will naturally, inevitably turn out alright in the end. And the closer this civil war is, the less you have to worry. Ironically then, though the idea of the looming spontaneous civil war promises the most radical action there could feasibly be, it is in fact an idea designed to ensure the exact opposite. The idea is meant to de-radicalise, to steer people away from making plans to gain power, and to inspire in them a certain intellectual laziness that gives people an excuse not to bother and not to take radical risks. If you know that nobody's going to save you, your only option is to save yourself. But if you think that help is on its way, you may just sit in eternity, waiting for the saviour that never comes. This is why the regime, through various pundits, pushes, platforms and promotes the idea of a looming civil war. It is a containment strategy designed to de-radicalise you by convincing you that someone else will do the job. End of story. Anyway, thank you for watching. I understand that my way of thinking here is quite the inverse of the norm, yet I think that that only proves how twisted the lies of the establishment regime have become. To see through the lies is a rare ability indeed, and one that I have only recently acquired. But please do let me know what you think of my theory. Were you convinced by or on board with the idea of civil war before, and if so, what do you think now? Otherwise, please consider joining the channel and at least press the join button to preview the options. And finally, like, subscribe, and remember that the trust of the innocent is the liar's most useful tool.